After dating for 6 years, my fiancée said she needed time to think. I gave her forever. I waited once before, when she wasn't ready to commit 2 years ago. This time, I didn't beg or argue. I just let her think, while I packed my things. Turns out, clarity comes fast when you're alone. After dating for 6 years, my fiancée, Vanessa, told me she needed time to think. I didn't argue. I'd heard that line before, 2 years ago, when she said she wasn't ready to commit. Back then, I waited patiently, thinking it was a temporary hesitation. I thought love required patience, that waiting was part of building something real. But this time, I didn't wait. I just nodded, took a deep breath, and let her words hang in the air, cold and heavy like fog creeping into every corner of the apartment. It all started a few weeks ago at her friend Meredith's engagement party. The house was bright, overflowing with laughter, champagne flutes clinking against plates, and the faint tang of roasted chicken lingering in the air. Vanessa was in her element, effortlessly charming everyone. Her laughter a little too sharp, her comments a little too pointed. I watched her across the crowded living room, noticing the way she leaned toward her friends and gestured broadly, her words carrying farther than she realized. Or maybe she did realize, and that was the point. She spent the night talking about how some men just know how to provide, loud enough for everyone in the living room to hear. Not casually, not in passing, like she was delivering a thesis on the merits of a particular type of man. I tried to laugh along at first, thinking it was harmless exaggeration. But the way her friends nodded, whispered, and chuckled in agreement, the way Vanessa's eyes darted to see my reaction, made something tighten in my chest. This wasn't just conversation. It was a verdict. When I tried to change the subject, she smiled, just enough to disarm, and said, "Relax, Jake. I'm just saying not everyone wants a small apartment forever." The words were casual, like they were tossed off, but everyone around us paused for a beat. Conversations stuttered. Laughter faltered. Forks hovered in midair. The weight of what she said was unmistakable. It was a subtle public execution of my life choices, my priorities, my worth. A subtle, devastating dismissal. People around us went quiet, some shifting uncomfortably, some pretending not to notice, but I noticed. I always noticed. That was the moment I realized she'd stopped being my partner and started being my critic. The moment I realized she wasn't sharing life with me anymore. She was evaluating it, grading it, benchmarking it against some invisible standard I could never meet. We left the party early. I tried to pretend everything was normal, even smiled at a neighbor who waved, all the while feeling the heat rise in my neck. Vanessa chatted about the night ahead, about brunch plans with her friends for the weekend, as if nothing had happened. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything that might salvage what was left of the evening, but the words lodged in my throat, heavy and pointless. This was a different Vanessa, or maybe it was the same one I'd always loved, just revealed in a harsher light. That night, lying awake in our bedroom, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional car alarm from the street below, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. I had been ignoring the signs, the subtle barbs in conversation, the backhanded compliments masquerading as concern, the way she framed my successes as insufficient. The engagement party wasn't the start. It was just the lens through which I finally saw everything for what it had become. Over the years, I had made sacrifices, small and large. Moving into her city, postponing career moves, adjusting weekends around her friends and family, all the little compromises that felt like love. But love shouldn't feel like a performance where one person holds the scorecard, where every choice is scrutinized, measured, and found wanting. I remember the quiet moments, the ones she probably didn't notice, when she laughed at jokes that cut too close, when she called my apartment cozy with a smirk, when she dismissed my passions as trivial. I had brushed it off, told myself I was overthinking. But now, staring at the ceiling, I realized I hadn't been overthinking. I'd been enduring a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of respect and partnership. The realization hit like a flinch. I had been in a relationship with a woman who no longer saw me as an equal, no longer treated our shared life as something sacred. I was a placeholder for convenience, a critic of myself through someone else's eyes. By morning, I knew something had to change. I couldn't continue on the path of silent acquiescence, pretending the sharp words and subtle dismissals were inconsequential. The weight of 6 years, the compromises, the careful investments of trust and emotion, had shifted into a ledger of debts I could no longer pay, debts of respect, of reciprocity, of mutual care. And the cold truth, waiting, pleading, hoping, it would accomplish nothing. She had handed me the opportunity to decide. And I was going to decide with the precision of someone finally willing to see clearly, finally willing to act, even if that action scared me. Her name was Lauren. We met in college. She was funny, warm, confident. I thought she valued real connection over money or appearances. Back then, she stayed up late talking about philosophy, books, dreams. We shared apartments, ramen noodles, and endless all-nighters. I believed we had built a foundation beyond the superficial. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Somewhere along the way, she started measuring life by benchmarks I couldn't or wouldn't meet. It was a Thursday night. Her coworkers had invited us to a celebratory dinner. A newly promoted colleague, fancy table settings, too many candles, the kind of restaurant with white tablecloths that made clinking glasses sound ceremonial. Lauren was radiant, effortless. I arrived in a tailored blazer, my standard polished look, confident but understated. She arrived in a floor-length dress that shimmered under the low lights, hair falling perfectly over her shoulders. We were the couple everyone assumed had chemistry, the kind that made friends nod approvingly. But chemistry isn't measured in appearances, it's measured in alignment. And that alignment had begun to fracture. Early in the evening, her coworkers chatted about investments, weekend getaways, and side hustles. I listened, contributed, kept up, but kept it modest. I'd been working at the engineering firm for 6 years, $68,000 a year, solid but not flashy. I spoke about the new design project I was leading, the late nights drafting schematics, the innovations in thermal efficiency we were piloting. I thought that would impress. I thought competence mattered. Then came the comment. She laughed at something someone else said, then added, loud enough to echo across the table. He's too loyal to his paycheck. Needs to dream bigger. The words hit like a cold draft. Her laugh was light, teasing, but not harmless. It was layered, a criticism disguised as humor. I forced a smile, took a sip of water, and tried to brush it off. Everyone around us laughed politely. I wondered if they were laughing at me or with her. A cocktail of embarrassment and anger rose in my chest. Later, when the waiter brought the wine list, I chose the $45 bottle, well-regarded, respectable. Lauren, eyeing the $150 selection, rolled her eyes. Really? She whispered, as if my choice was a reflection of some deficiency in ambition or taste. I smiled faintly, shrugging. I like this one, I said, but her expression made it clear. My judgment, my preferences, my prudence, all inadequate. Her world had started running on a different metric, one that didn't include practicality, humility, or shared values. By the end of the night, the subtle slights had accumulated into a gnawing unease. I thought we could leave and laugh it off. Maybe she would apologize later, a playful nudge, something to bring us back to equilibrium. But as we walked to the car, she fumbled with her phone and posted something I hadn't anticipated. A photo of us at the table, smiling. Caption: manifesting a man who dreams bigger. I asked about it when we reached the car. Lauren, I said, calm but firm, what's this about? She glanced at her phone, scrolling quickly, brushing back a strand of hair. It's just a quote, she said lightly. Something inspiring I liked. No big deal. But I knew better. I could see it in her eyes, the small, sharp glint of judgment, the almost imperceptible smirk. It wasn't just a quote. It was a warning, a line drawn, a public declaration of dissatisfaction, broadcast to her network of friends and colleagues. That night, lying awake in our shared apartment, I replayed the dinner. The laugh, the eye roll, the caption. Every action, every word, every glance seemed deliberate now. I realized she had stopped seeing me as an equal partner. I wasn't a companion to her life, I was a placeholder, an experiment, a cautionary tale. The person I thought I was building a future with had started measuring my worth in metrics that mattered to her peers, to the world, but not to me. The thought was dizzying and corrosive. 6 years reduced to a social commentary, to a punchline. I tried to reconcile the memory of the woman I loved with the one who stood at that table, laughing at my choices, questioning my ambitions, projecting a vision of a better man. The dissonance made my chest tighten. I understood then that love without respect is fragile, and hers had begun to fracture. Her desire to manifest something new wasn't abstract. It was aimed squarely at me. And for the first time in years, I felt the pull of a cold clarity. Something had to give. By morning, I knew the stakes had shifted. This wasn't a casual misalignment. It was a turning point. If I didn't act, I would continue to exist in her narrative. Insufficient, judged, perpetually lacking. The decision crystallized. I would no longer bend silently to her ever-changing expectations, her social metrics, her carefully curated critiques. And the first step would have to be decisive, visible, undeniable. A week later, we sat across from each other in our apartment. The one under my name, paid for entirely with my savings, every utility in my name, every lease agreement and insurance policy accounted for. Sunlight streamed in through the blinds, highlighting the dust motes that drifted lazily across the living room. There was a fragile calm in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Lauren sat on the edge of the couch, legs crossed, hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Her eyes met mine, wide, anxious, searching for some reaction, some plea, some desperation, but there was none. "I just feel like we're stuck," she said finally, her voice trembling but steady. "I love you, I do, but I need space to figure out what I really want." There was a pause, a breath between us, weighted with the history of 6 years. The shared apartments, the weekend trips, the inside jokes, the long nights talking until dawn about everything and nothing. But all that history didn't matter to her in that moment. It wasn't enough to anchor her. I leaned back, fingers interlaced, and kept my tone calm, deliberately neutral. "And what if you realize it's not me?" I asked, letting the words hang in the air like a suspended verdict. My voice wasn't accusatory, wasn't laced with hurt or anger. It was just factual, an assessment of probability rather than emotion. She exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping to the coffee table. "Then I guess it's not meant to be," she murmured. Her words weren't angry, but they weren't gentle either. They were resolute, practiced, the culmination of months of subtle disengagement, coded messages, and small withdrawals that I had been too trusting or too hopeful to notice. There it was, the exit door she'd been building for months, piece by piece, layer by layer, until it stood fully constructed and ready to swing open. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I didn't make excuses or recite the long list of compromises I'd made over the years. I didn't remind her of the weekends I'd canceled to be with her, the nights I'd stayed late at work to cover her overtime, the dinners I'd cooked after long days to keep us nourished and together. None of it mattered. I just said, "Okay." The word landed with the force of a hammer striking glass. It wasn't meant to wound, but it shattered something she assumed she could predict. Her brow furrowed, confusion flashing across her face, perhaps even fear. For the first time, she realized I wasn't going to fight for her this time, that the battle she expected, the tears, the pleading, the late-night rationalizations, would not happen. I had reached the point where silence and acceptance carried more weight than any argument could. She blinked, lips parted as if she might argue, but nothing came. I watched the tension in her shoulders shift, tighten, then slump in disbelief. I could see the old familiarity of our connection slipping through her fingers. I could see her trying to reconcile the woman who once adored me with the version that had grown increasingly impatient, increasingly dissatisfied, increasingly critical. I'd spent years trying to prove I was enough. Enough to meet her expectations. Enough to match her ambitions. Enough to survive the quiet judgments she whispered when she thought I wasn't listening. I had measured myself against her ideals, scaled myself down, adjusted my routines, changed my wardrobe, refined my habits, all in the hope of being the person she wanted. And now I realized that no matter what I did, it was never about me. It was about the narrative she needed to justify her own discontent. The apartment was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant honk of a car outside, the faint. Lauren shifted again, hesitation evident, lips quivering, searching for the familiar pattern of apologies, promises, or pleas I had once given her. None would come. I wasn't the person who would chase her back into the warmth of familiarity. I wasn't the person who would wait for her indecision to settle. I wasn't the person who would allow her to dismantle my life one subtle barb at a time. I looked at her, and in that moment, I was fully present, fully awake to what the relationship had become. I was not angry. I was not bitter. I was simply done. And that, more than any argument, more than any ultimatum, more than any confrontation, was what truly unsettled her. The next morning, Lauren left the apartment to clear her head. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, her hand lingering for a moment longer than usual. Her eyes flicked away, not meeting mine, and I felt a familiar pang, part longing, part suspicion. I watched her go, a strange calm settling over me. Something inside shifted, an awareness that the waiting, the hoping, the silent adjustments I had been making for years had come to a natural end. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a mutual friend, Liam, who had been inadvertently looped into the orbit of her social life. He sent a photo. Lauren, laughing, leaning into Mark. Her ex-same Mark she had insisted for months was just a friend from the past. In the image, the sunlight hit her hair perfectly, the champagne glass catching reflections, the sort of candid photo that looks effortless but is carefully framed. She wasn't crying, wasn't conflicted, wasn't questioning. She was laughing. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't even glance at my phone again. Instead, I sat on the edge of our bed, letting the moment settle, letting the sting of betrayal mix with a strange clarity. This wasn't about anger. It was about recognition. The person I had trusted with my life, my time, my love, had quietly rewritten the rules of engagement without a word to me. She had moved the finish line, shifted the standards, and had already begun living on the new terms without me. I began packing. Not frantically, not angrily, but methodically, clinically. Every shelf, every drawer, every closet was cataloged, sorted, and boxed. I focused on things that were mine, books, personal mementos, clothing I had purchased for myself. I left the shared items, the ones she might claim or consider hers, untouched. Each box sealed was a measure of reclaiming control, a subtle declaration that the inertia she relied on to maintain influence over my life no longer worked. When she returned that evening, she froze at the threshold of the bedroom. Her eyes widened, her mouth parted in disbelief. She stepped inside cautiously, each footfall measured, hesitant. "You're really leaving?" she asked, voice tight, a mixture of accusation and desperation. "You said you needed time to think?" I replied evenly, lifting a carefully packed box from the floor. "Take all the time you want." My tone was calm, deliberate. No tremor, no pleading, no attempt to sway her. I let the words linger, letting them fall like small stones in a quiet pond, ripples of consequence extending outward. Her voice cracked. "You're overreacting," she said, shaking her head slightly as she gestured toward the half-empty closet. Her eyes searched mine, as if looking for the man she once knew, the one who would have begged, cajoled, or reasoned with her until exhaustion. "No," I said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I'm just reacting later than I should have." The pause between us stretched taut, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. She had given me every signal, every opportunity, every subtle push to make my decision sooner. I had waited, hoped, and measured. Now the timing was mine, and I acted with the precision of someone who had finally decided that indecision was a luxury I could no longer afford. Her hands fell to her sides, tense, fingers curling slightly. I could see the calculation in her eyes. Shock, disbelief, a creeping realization that she had misjudged the consequences of her own actions. She had assumed I would remain tethered, pliable, endlessly available, waiting for her to choose or return. But I wasn't waiting anymore. My belongings, the boxes stacked along the walls, were evidence of a life gradually, irrevocably detaching from the illusion of permanence she assumed existed. I continued working, folding shirts, sliding books into sturdy cardboard containers, labeling each one with meticulous care. She moved closer, hesitating, trying to read some indication of mercy, compromise, or emotional vulnerability. There was none. I was measured, detached, unwavering. Each action was deliberate, a tangible boundary drawn in the space we had once shared. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're serious," she said, almost to herself. I nodded without looking up. "Completely," I said. The finality in my tone was not angry, it was neutral, resolute, inevitable. I had waited long enough. I had tried to bend, to accommodate, to reason, to prove that my patience and loyalty could withstand the shifting tides of her uncertainty. Now there was only action, quiet, decisive, and unarguable. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift. Not the burden of her presence, but the burden of compromise, of bending, of silent acquiescence. The apartment, once filled with shared dreams and whispered promises, had become the canvas for closure. The boxes, the labels, the careful inventory, they were not just things packed. They were the architecture of reclaiming myself. The realization hit fully. This wasn't just a breakup. This was a reclamation, correction, a boundary made real in living color, in the space where indecision had reigned too long. I moved into a small place across town, a modest apartment with high ceilings, creaking floorboards, and a balcony overlooking the street. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, completely, fully, without compromise. Boxes lined the walls, still half unpacked, remnants of the careful extraction of my life from the apartment Lauren once called ours. I slept on a borrowed mattress, drank coffee from a chipped mug, and finally let the quiet settle around me. The first night, the silence was almost intoxicating, a balm after the years of subtle criticism, the laugh-tinged jabs, the casual dismissals. Then the calls started. 2 the first week. I let them go to voicemail, letting her frustration play out in unanswered messages. Then 10 the next week. 30 the week after that, each more urgent, more insistent than the last. Her texts arrived in bursts. Snippets, entire paragraphs, voice notes, photos of her empty apartment, evidence of her loneliness. I made a mistake. One message read, time-stamped at 3:14 a.m. "It didn't mean anything," another whispered through the ether, the words punctuated by ellipses, as if she couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence without doubt gnawing at it. I just needed to see what I really wanted. Came the third, a full paragraph, written in careful sentences, each one pleading, explaining, rationalizing, attempting to rewrite history in her favor. I didn't respond. I didn't reply. I didn't even glance at the timestamps beyond a passing curiosity. Silence became my shield, my statement, my boundary. She wanted closure, a conversation, a negotiation, a return to the familiar rhythms she assumed existed. I gave her silence. Complete, unwavering, unyielding silence. A month passed. My routine solidified: morning coffee, bike rides along the river, work emails, the occasional visit with friends. The world felt lighter, freer, but the tension simmered just below the surface, the expectation of confrontation lingering like a shadow. I didn't look for it. I let it arrive. It did, predictably, one Thursday evening. The doorbell rang, insistent, urgent. I looked through the peephole and froze. Lauren, disheveled, tear-streaked, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a small tote bag with what I assumed were the last remnants of the life she thought she could reclaim. My chest tightened, not in longing, but in anticipation of the storm I had refused for weeks. She pushed the door open without waiting for permission. "I can't eat," she said, voice quivering. "I can't sleep. I can't believe you gave up that easily. You just left. Just walked away." Her hands trembled as she reached for the door frame, seeking balance, seeking grounding. I stepped aside, letting her in, but kept my posture calm, controlled. I haven't given up, I said evenly, carefully. I haven't given up at all. I've simply stopped pretending. I've stopped adjusting, bending, shrinking myself to fit an image you decided was insufficient. Her lips trembled, and she sank into the couch, hands in her lap, staring at the floor. But you can't just. You asked for space, I interrupted softly, almost tenderly. You wanted space to think, to figure out what you really wanted. You have it. Use it. She looked up, eyes brimming with tears, confusion mingled with frustration. This isn't fair. You don't even care. I shook my head slightly. I do care. I care enough to stop participating in a dynamic where my worth is measured against whims, standards, and imaginary benchmarks. I care enough to be honest with myself. That's why I'm here. That's why I've acted the way I have. Not to punish, not to humiliate, but to reclaim my life, my choices, and my time. She slumped back further, sobs rising. A raw display of emotion that had no hold over me anymore. I didn't flinch. I didn't step closer. I simply remained, a witness, a boundary, a quiet presence that reflected a truth she had refused to see. Actions have consequences, and indecision, duplicity, and betrayal have a cost. She tried again, voice cracking with desperation. Please just talk to me. Just tell me what I can do. I met her gaze, unwavering. You've already told me everything I need to know. You've made your choices. I made mine. I am no longer available to be an experiment in your indecision. Use the space you asked for. Make it meaningful. Learn from it. I've done what I can, what you demanded. Now it's your turn. For the first time, I watched the weight of my silence sink into her fully. Her sobs quieted, replaced by disbelief. The realization that she couldn't control me, manipulate me, or reclaim what she assumed was hers, began to register. I didn't need to speak again. The apartment, the half-packed boxes, the deliberate absence of reaction. All of it communicated the truth with far greater force than words ever could. She left that night, voice muted, eyes avoiding mine, carrying with her the knowledge that the rules had changed. I remained, in the quiet apartment, finally breathing in a life where my choices were my own, and silence was not emptiness. It was freedom. 6 months later, I heard she was dating Mark again. The same Mark who had once been the definition of toxic in her life. The one she swore she'd never see again. I didn't feel the sting I expected. No pangs of jealousy, no hollow ache in my chest. Instead, there was a strange, steady calm. I had rebuilt my life, piece by piece, from the ashes of the 6 years we had shared. I had unpacked boxes of belongings, restructured routines, reclaimed weekends and evenings for myself. My apartment became a sanctuary, filled with books, artwork, and furniture that reflected my choices, not hers. I had found peace in silence, in boundaries, in the clarity of decisive action. I realized the hardest truth. Sometimes, love doesn't end with a fight. It doesn't require screaming matches, ultimatums, or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it ends quietly, with a recognition that the other person is no longer aligned with the life you are building. You outgrow them. They keep you small, tethered to constant reassessment, always questioning your worth, your decisions, your judgment. And the most painful part is how gradual it is. The erosion begins with subtle jokes, veiled criticisms, small withdrawals of respect. You tell yourself it's trivial. You compromise, negotiate internally, hope that love will bridge the gap. Until the gap becomes a chasm. I remember one Tuesday evening in particular. I had spent the afternoon at the new climbing gym, then grabbed a coffee, sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city stretch out in golden light. My phone buzzed. A notification from a mutual friend. Lauren had posted a picture with Mark, a snapshot of them laughing over wine at some rooftop bar. The caption read, "Finally feeling like we're back on track." I stared at it for a moment, then swiped away. My heartbeat didn't quicken. My breath didn't hitch. I realized the lesson had embedded itself deep within me. She had chosen, and I had chosen. The past 6 months of silence, reflection, and deliberate focus on my own boundaries had crystallized into immunity. Weeks passed. I continued building my life intentionally. I enrolled in a certification course I had always wanted but deferred for her whims. I began biking longer routes along the river, exploring neighborhoods I had never seen, meeting people I didn't know, laughing in ways I hadn't allowed myself. I planted herbs on the balcony, filled shelves with journals, notebooks, and small art projects, each one a statement. This is my life, my choices, my control, my peace. A year after the breakup, on my 31st birthday, my phone buzzed with a text notification. It was from Lauren. Simple, understated. I miss who we used to be. I stared at it for a long time. The words felt both vulnerable and audacious, an attempt to reclaim something that no longer existed, an echo of the person she wanted me to be rather than the person I had become. I didn't reply, not because I was petty or cruel, not because I wanted to punish her. I didn't reply because I finally understood the pattern, the quiet, insidious testing of loyalty, the expectation that I would remain tethered to her explorations, that I would wait for her to decide, on her terms, whether I was still acceptable. That expectation had defined much of our relationship. The compromises I had made, the arguments I had internalized, the subtle reshaping of my life to fit her fluctuating standards. This time, I didn't wait. I didn't question, agonize, or second-guess. I didn't reconstruct the arguments, the apologies, or the compromises. I gave her exactly what she had demanded when she said she needed space. Freedom. Freedom to explore. Freedom to choose. Freedom to see if her ex, her ambitions, or her whims made her happier. Freedom to realize, eventually, that the life she wanted was not mine to provide. I sat back on my balcony, the city lights flickering in the distance, the smell of night air mixed with herbs and concrete. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a solid weight in my chest that had nothing to do with victory or revenge. I had acted with clarity, with intention, with respect for my own life. I had stopped shrinking to meet someone else's measure of success, affection, or worth. I gave her forever, the forever of my absence, my boundaries, my silence. And in that giving, I reclaimed myself. I wasn't waiting for someone to decide I was enough. I knew I was, and that, in the end, was more than enough.